two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today for the second time with Justin Bloesch, an economist at Cornell's ILR school. Um, Last time we talked about inflation, and to summarize it, inflation can be caused by actions of the Federal Reserve but also by companies and how they set prices. But when it came to the question of housing costs, it sounded like there were some, you might say, special wrinkles in the whole thing. And of course, the cost of housing is a huge problem in Tompkins County and especially in the city of Ithaca. So, Justin Blesh, say a bit about what is special about the cost of housing.
Sure. So thanks for having me back. What makes housing different is really two things. So one is that a lot of the cost of housing is not coming from what's like the cost of producing the house, in large part because it's land. And land values, if you buy a piece of land and rent it out, you can kind of charge whatever people are willing to pay. And it's also hard to create more land, and basically physically impossible. So the
Well,
fact
not
that house,
impossible. The Dutch used to do it,
yeah,
and
right,
Manhattan learned how to do it.
they did, but we're not adding any, we're not building that much housing into Cayuga Lake, for example. So the fact that supply is really constrained, it's hard to build more, and the cost of rent, for example, doesn't have to be that tied to the cost of producing a house because ultimately the cost of the land is really important as well. And since you can't make more land, the relationship between costs and prices doesn't, isn't linked in the same way that it might be in most other things that are produced.
I see. And I have also heard it argued that when our county industrial development agency um, abates taxes for the first few years of a new building, including often an expensive apartment building, that pro that abatement actually allows for an increased cost of land.
It's probably true. Maybe let's dig into a little bit like why rent is what it is. So, um, the economist answer is going to be supply and demand to start, but let's kind of dissect that a little bit. So, in a lot of ways, landlords can charge, they can charge whatever they want. And there's a question of like, what is the constraint on landlords? What would make them not want to charge higher rent? So, why don't they charge, 5,000 a month for a one bedroom in Ithaca rather than two or well, maybe is what is average? And usually the answer is because people are not going to rent at that level. So they're facing a trade-off that they know if they pay a lower or they offer a lower rent, they're more likely to fill their units. But if they charge higher rent, they're less likely, and it's more likely to go vacant. Sometimes you'll hear people say landlords profit from charging high rents and keeping vacant apartments. this is generally not true. I mean, landlords do make money by collecting rent, and they need tenants. And so what's disciplining them is, are tenants going to go somewhere else where the rent is lower? There's a couple of things influencing about how much they can charge. And when supply is pretty constrained and you can't build apartments very easy or quickly, it's really down to what people are willing to pay. So, how high, given the number of bedrooms there are, really the question is, how high does rent need to be in order for someone to not rent an apartment or to, you know, find roommates or to live with their parents or, maybe end up being homeless? What is the rent level that cuts off people's desire to rent an apartment? And it turns out that number is often really high and often a really high share of people's income. And then what that means is that as people's income goes up, the amount that they, technically can spend on rent, maybe they're completely broke after paying rent, but as people's income goes up, the amount that landlords can charge basically goes up one for one. So there are many situations where you say, well, okay, well, maybe wages are going up on average a little bit each year. But as long as there's kind of a fixed amount of housing, rent can kind of rise one for one with that.
or
Um,
faster,
or I mean, or faster. Yeah. So
which I
yeah,
think we're experiencing.
I mean, over the last certainly 20 or 30 years, rent has gone up more than wages. Part of that might be that people with money now find it more desirable to live closer in. So, 40 years ago, when a lot of cities were hollowing out, middle and upper middle class people were moving out to the suburbs, and there was all this housing stock that was not in really demand except by people with lower income. And so then rent didn't really rise a lot in the 60s and 70s. Since the 90s, as higher income people have been moving back towards city centers, it's people who can just afford more rent are moving into a scarce number of units. Um, and building can be quite expensive. And maybe we should go into some of the building costs next.
Sure.
So one thing to keep in mind is that building in places where existing buildings already exist is much more expensive than building on open land. So there's a couple of reasons for this. So one is that, the land, say in downtown Ithaca, is going to be more valuable than 15 miles outside of Ithaca. Second, there's already a building there, right? So the only time that it is worth it to actually purchase a plot of land, tear down what's already on it, and build something new, if you're going to incur all those costs, the only way that that's profitable is if what you can, rent those new units for is super expensive. You mentioned land prices. So there's kind of a perverse thing in that if you allow more density, certainly then you can produce more units per unit of land. However, if you upzone, so if you increase sort of the legal limit of how many units you can build on a piece of land, that can raise the land value because it raises how much money you could make by owning that piece of land and developing it. And so that just simply means that if you are building something that is new construction, and it's also worth keeping in mind that new construction buildings have a lot more, building code are just much more developed. Buildings are a lot safer than they used to be. But that also means that there's a lot of requirements that makes new buildings very expensive. And
True.
so
Yes.
what
In
that
fact, something I remember from Ithaca of a few past decades is a lot of buildings burnt. A lot of those old apartment houses you were talking about kind of not considered very desirable. And to put a bit of blame on the inhabitants, I have a feeling some were some were alcoholics and many were smokers. And well, you can almost see it in downtown Ithaca. If you walk around and there's an apartment building and a parking lot and another apartment building, chances are 40 years ago there was an apartment building on the location of that parking lot.
Yeah, and so it's a lot harder to burn down new buildings than it is old apartment buildings. But part of this, so the safety that comes with that is the higher cost of building. And so if you're thinking about building brand new units, so even take affordable housing units, it's very hard to construct a family-sized housing unit for less than $300,000 after you account for all, every step of the way. If you're building, and then whether it's that's sort of funded by the public level with sort of public financing for affordable housing or market rate. And so if you're building affordable housing, it's quite expensive for new units. And then if you're building market rate housing, from the builder side, they expect a particular return, and the banks that lend them require, I don't know maybe an exact number off my head, but maybe about 15% sort of rate of return on their loans. Plus, when buildings take a longer time to build, apartments are not getting revenue for the first 3 or 4 years. So if you think about like in the way that student loans accumulate, right? You graduate, maybe like while you're in school, you're paying interest, but that interest is accumulating, and then you pay interest on the interest that you accumulated. It's the same thing for builders that are building larger buildings, that if it takes multiple years, that interest accumulates, and that just adds to the cost, which ends up in higher rent. So what the reason why you see luxury development, every new building is a luxury development, is just that the actual cost of building the building and then paying for the financing from banks means that the only way that they can meet that rate of return is to charge a very high rent, which only exists if there's that high income renters to do it. So it's a real challenge. I think like building affordable housing building new housing is either affordable only to high income people or takes a lot of public dollars. And it's just where we are now. That is what construction costs look like.
Yeah, well, in fact, in Ithaca, a lot of the, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the that land that you said what didn't exist because everything was built is on the site of abandoned factories. So we have construction going on where once there was a famous gun factory. And we have a project, I think not quite at the construction phase, although close to it, on the where there used to be Morse chain.
Yeah, and our house is on an old coal yard. Yeah, and there's an interesting like life cycle to buildings, just because a building that's 30 years old and still in decent condition, it's too expensive to buy it and then tear it down. So the only thing that is actually affordable to redevelop is things that are very old and often kind of dilapidated, but often where people with lower incomes are living. And so the process of building new buildings has this feature of this of you know the gentrifying, the actual change of the building when it's old. One thing worth noting is that the types of housing that is the least expensive to build is certainly like low-rise housing on the edges of town. So if you can get a plot of land at the edge of Ithaca or in the town somewhere and build a bunch of duplexes, those are often the sort of cheapest way that you can build market rate housing.
Yeah, and then you might say for the health of the world, the huge question is, will everybody in those suburban developments have two cars? Or will there be public transportation that takes them to their jobs in the city?
Right. Right.
And I think I would say, for that matter, one of the problems of promoting high cost, high rent new housing is that those really upscale, upper income people will probably bring cars. whether they really need them or not.
to the downtown area, right?
Now, there is a little, there are a couple of wrinkles involving that where a city can actually, you might say, affect housing, the amount of housing and the cost of housing. Um, and they are zoning questions. One is the question of how many people you allow to live, you might say, on a given lot. And if you allow more people to live there, well, the cost per person goes down, and it hasn't really raised the cost of the housing, of producing the housing. Another question is, do does the zoning require minimum off-street parking spaces, which at present it very frequently does. And so, in a sense, a lot of the space in the city has been handed over not to people, but to automobiles.
Right. And off-street parking requirements definitely raise the cost of building new buildings. I think both Minneapolis and maybe Portland are good examples of cities that have pulled back um on the parking requirements. And Minneapolis, I think in particular, has had a lot of success and a lot of new housing being constructed and rent being flat. It didn't bring rent down,
Wow.
but basically incomes went up when and rent was basically flat. So that's as far as like housing affordability policy, that's probably the best in a best case scenario. That's what a city could achieve. Um, but yeah, I think there's a couple things that the city can do, and definitely opting into the New York State rent stabilization. That would definitely help for people in existing units. Now that I forget the exact year, but I think that the that law was dated so
1974.
that 1974. Thank you. Right. So that kind of date needs to be updated where units that were built, say let's say 30 years ago are subject to rent stabilization. And the concern there is that builders might be hesitant to build if uh, you know the rents in new construction is regulated. And the compromise there that I think still enables or encourages building is buildings at least of a certain age are rent stabilized. And so um, opting into the New York State law is definitely a good step. Getting rid of restrictive single family zoning only wherever you can is always a good step. So as you said, if you can build a duplex rather than a single family house on a lot, that's two households that you can have housing for on the same amount of land. That's a good step. Um, and also, high rise, new construction, it should be part of the mix as well, because you want to have, you want to have your high income renters in your city to be renting the expensive stuff and not competing with lower income people for the more affordable, you often older housing too. So I think, rent stabilization, getting rid of single family restrictions, limiting off-street parking requirements, allowing some of the new bigger buildings, it has to be in sort of all of the above thing to bring rent down and hopefully incomes continue to go up.
There were, when the city budget was being considered last fall, people would, residents would come in and complain that high property taxes were driving the cost, making housing unaffordable. But I think I have heard that there is some, it isn't quite always like that.
Yeah, I mean, the first round effect of property taxes is it's more expensive to live in a house. Um, they do have a effect of lowering home prices. So if you're a new buyer, that should push prices down. And the way that you can think about this, so think about in California where um, uh, property taxes are very limited for if you locked in a long time ago. House prices can go very high. And you think someone of say middle high income thinking, should I buy this $1.5 million house? You know, if property taxes are very low, you might be able to afford that. And if property taxes were higher, you couldn't. So this is why we see in places like Texas, for example, where property tax rates are high, home prices are quite a bit lower than home prices in California. There are other things going on there about how easy to build, but property taxes do generally lower house prices. So if you're buying a new house and property taxes are higher, then the home value would be less, and then your mortgage costs would be less. So there's an offsetting effect of generally if you're a new buyer, higher property taxes, there's going to be some savings elsewhere, probably on the price and on the mortgage. If you've been in your home for a long time, there's just no way around it. Higher property taxes are simply more expensive. And so especially if people who are retired or have a fixed income, maybe own their house, but if you have a property tax bill of $12,000, $15,000 a year, that can be really unaffordable for people in that situation.
Well, of course, if they decided to share the house with somebody else, it might become affordable. Um, or for that matter, this is the move toward allowing um, auxiliary dwelling units, as I think it's called, ADUs. Uh, you can, without the cost of building a whole new building, you can make some alterations to your home that make it possible for an unrelated person to live there and have some privacy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and
And
ADUs are a nice way to just add another avenue in the housing mix to create affordable options and potentially extra income for the homeowners.
so I think, in fact, there will be discussion of this in the city of Ithaca, as well as discussion of minimum off-street parking requirements.
Yeah, good. That's where we should go.
Uh, in fact, well, in a sense, we also then get into questions that perhaps move away a little bit from the cost of housing and into the cost to the environment. Uh, and that is, I think we know that lots of automobile use puts a lot of pollution into the air. Let's just leave it at that. Um, Ultimately changes the climate. If there is adequate public transportation, people don't have to use as many cars. If some of those people who found affordable housing by moving out of the city and driving in to work can turn to public transportation, the city could probably actually have a new source of land, namely less used parking lots.
Right, right. And I think one of the challenges for that I think the city would also have to think about comprehensively is retail. On southwest part of Ithaca is like where all the big box stores, and a lot of times, smaller retail can be more expensive because there's a scale that the big boxes have, and so at the moment it's often very hard to get to those stores by public transit. It makes it easy to drive. So, thinking about where we can build density in housing, but how it also to support retailers so that, if you live downtown, you don't feel like you need to drive out to the commercial area, to go shopping as well.
Well, if you live centrally, you can get to the malls on the number 30 bus, which is what we do.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe we should summarize, or maybe you could summarize what are the things that drive up the cost of housing, especially rental housing.
Yeah, so the big ones are just going to be how many houses there are relative to how many people are in your city and the income that they have. Um, so one way to put it is that a big part of the problem is how many houses there are, and if we can build more houses, that'll bring housing costs down in general. There's a separate issue of, for many people, their income is just too low to really afford market rents. And so you need other things like rent subsidies or rent stabilization to make housing affordable for very low income people. And the third part is market power. So, there's, because it's a small town, there's only so many landlords that own a lot of land. Either breaking up concentration in home ownership or some more direct regulation can also be important for keeping rent from going up. So,
Well, thank you, Justin Bloesch. Uh, Good to hear more about the ins and outs of the cost of housing in the city, which uh, census statistics show that many, many Ithacans are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. That's what's known as rent burdened, I believe. And a significant number pay more than 50%, which is extreme cost burden. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.